Yeah, well, I'm pleased to be here, and I'm here because I've spent quite a bit of time studying private community associations in the United States. And they're not known as free cities, but listening to the discussion here, they probably qualify, roughly, given the fact that, real-world institutions are always messy, and they never conform exactly to theoretical specifications. And so Fred wrote a book in the 1990s. I think he's endorsed the idea that these community associations are something like free cities anyway. And Jason's idea of a spectrum, these probably qualify as belonging somewhere along his spectrum. So now the other thing that I really need to mention is it's somewhat remarkable. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this is a new movement just beginning. We need to get some ideas out there, try some things out. Now, so listening to the discussion here, you'd never know that by the definition of this conference, we have approximately 300,000 free cities in the United States. And and approximately 20% of the population of the United States lives in free cities. As I've been sitting here, I've been wondering about the question. I mean, this is not like a small little thing off in some corner. How is it that people here don't seem to know anything about this? Or, or at least they don't recognize that on a massive scale, the United States has been engaged in an experiment in free cities, to the extent of 20% of the population. And it's an interesting question, and I don't actually know the answer. I was just thinking about it as we were going through this conference, but I guess one of the reasons I came up with is because libertarians had nothing to do with it. And these institutions did in no way, well, Fred might have contributed a tiny amount, but these institutions in no way emerged from the planning or the thinking of any libertarian or even free market or Milton Friedman or anybody like that. They were basically a product of the development industry itself. And they kind of emerged in that sense, from the bottom up. And another reason I was thinking of is that these private cities in the United States do have some, commercial development, shopping facilities. In some cases, mostly they don't have any, but Reston, for example, has quite a bit. And so they're not precluded, but most of the people here, when they think of free cities, seem to be thinking of business, like the models are Hong Kong or Dubai or Singapore, and so we don't have any of them, at least not in these community associations are basically all essentially oriented towards residential use. So housing. And they are about the right size, though. I mean, very typical would be 1,000 people. And, they do go up. Some of them, the smallest one is, I think, two housing units. And they do go up to, 60 or 100,000 people. But the more normal is 1,000, 5,000 maybe. So they're residential. So they don't look like Hong Kong at all. And the other thing that I was thinking about is that they don't exactly look like bastions of freedom either. And, another reason people don't know about them is because the American media doesn't pay much attention to them, nor does the American Academy, nor do American foundations. With one exception, which is the Liberty Fund. And I know because I directed 2 Liberty Fund conferences on this subject. Jason actually went to one of them. And so the thing that I would comment on is, there is this old saying, be careful because you might get what you wish for. And these associations are basically like little socialisms. And they control in very fine detail what people are allowed to do. And they also precipitate a lot of internal conflict and litigation, and people routinely say that, when we enter them, even though we signed on the dotted line and met Fred's requirement, they just say, well, when I bought my apartment unit or condo unit, they gave me a pile of things about this big, and they were all, they were like 40 different places I had to sign, and I didn't know what I was signing, and it's probably true in a substantial number of cases. So but the whole idea of signing a contract and knowing what it means assumes that you can write down and cover all your future contingencies. So even if they did spend a day studying it, they probably still wouldn't know what it meant, and in terms of what would actually apply to them in the future. And so the bottom line is that when we had these Liberty Fund conferences, there was really a love-hate relationship with these associations. And they clearly met the theoretical, in their rough-hewn way, ideal that we've been talking about, a contracted form of governance, people getting together, signing a constitution, governing themselves, geographically based, units of 1,000, 2,000 people. And so, libertarians said, this is great. But then they actually looked at how they work. And they said, God, this is terrible. And this is the biggest infringement on freedom in the United States. And so, anyway, that's all. So there's in libertarian circles, when people actually look at these associations closely, you basically, I would call it a love-hate relationship. And they don't really know what to think about it. It's kind of a problem, which makes it interesting. So that's all preface. Used up more time on that. But anyway, this is what I'm going to give you some background. Having said all that, I wrote a book. It's called Private Neighborhoods and the Transformation of Local Government. It's 500 pages long and more than you would ever want to know about this subject, I'm sure, but you could skim parts of it. And so it came out in 2005. I'm going to give a very, very brief, obviously, overview of some of the key points that I make when talking about this subject. So there are basically, we call them, private neighborhoods or community associations is actually the term of art. They include homeowners associations. Those typically involve single-family homes bound together in owning common areas through common forms of ownership. Condominiums are sometimes homes, but more often or frequently, buildings, apartment. So they're condo units, like apartment units that you own individually. You're all probably familiar with these. But these are the percentages roughly in those 300,000 in the United States. And cooperatives, which are a special category of their own, are roughly 10%. Okay, so they conform to the model that's been talked about this morning. They are, in fact, corporations. They're organized like corporations. They're nonprofit, but they're basically follow the model of business corporations from state incorporation laws that were originally designed for business. They have a board of directors. The board is the controlling, just like a business, the board is the controlling authority. The board elects the president and the other officers. Unlike businesses, these are all volunteers, although that could change in the future. One of my messages of my book is that we're really just at the beginning, and actually all of these bad things that sometimes happen could be fixed with some revisions to the structure of the whole institution. And another key thing is the ownership lies in the units, which is property. So the voters are the unit owners. Frequently, not always, it's one vote per unit. So this divorces voting from ideas of sovereignty. If you're a citizen of Guatemala, you can vote on the management of your condo in Miami, just like any American. Or if you're an American and you got a home in New York and a home in Florida, you can vote on vote for the management of both of them, which is kind of nice, actually. It seems like it ought to be that way. Okay, so this is the portrayal of revolution is an overworked term, but it's actually getting close to a revolution in terms of ownership in the United States. You look at 1970, we had 10,000 of these private cities, as we want to call them that in terms of the parlance of this conference. So by 2010, was up to 310,000. This is an incredible, spread over the American landscape. Housing units, 700,000 to 25 million. People living in these community associations / private cities, 2 million to 62 million. And this is more than an experiment. This is as I call it, a transformation. And so it's a big deal. Okay, how are these associations created? And here again, it's a completely different system. The old-fashioned system for collective local governance was a municipality. People moved in, they decided to incorporate as a municipality, they had a vote, was majority rule, they designed their municipal government as part of that process and then voted whether they wanted it or not. So the government came after the people. Here, the government comes before the people. Again, follows the model that we've been talking about. The developer creates the government. So it's basically a private, business decision to create and structure the government. And he basically, the way the developer has to do this, you can never create these where you have too many people living there, because you have to basically get ownership of a large piece of land if you're going to have 1,000 or 5,000 residents. So basically, these are all being created in relatively new areas, and where you can buy a large farm and make it into a whole development. Developer not only creates the government, but plans the whole thing. And so it's private planning in comprehensive, excruciating detail, but it's private. It's profit-oriented. And so the developer then files the declaration with the local government. It's basically a property right transaction, and we call it a private constitution, because it basically governs all the operating internal rules of the association. As with other constitutions, you can amend it. It's not fixed, but it's hard to amend, because you have to get a 66 or 75% of the vote. Now, initially, the developer controls basically almost all the votes, because the developer creates this government, and then builds the whole town, or the city, or whatever the community, and then puts the units on the market. And so obviously the developer is not going to be willing to turn over the management of this whole thing to the, if there's 4 owners. And so there's an elaborate transitional process. But the way it actually works is that the full management shifts to the actual unit owners at about 75% of completion of the development. And during the interim period, the developer controls most of the voting shares in the association. So basically, the Neighborhood is managed by an association. It's elected by the unit owners, and there are rules for transition. So okay, so this is what I call the transformation of local government. So I said that if you look at where these associations are common, it's in newly growing areas. So they're all over the place in Florida, Texas. There are not as many being built now because of the recession, but in a lot of these areas, basically every new large development was a private city, and so basically those private community associations have been replacing the role of local government in the public sector, which was usually municipal government in the Midwest and the Northeast of the United States, where you had municipalities that were public governments of 1,000 people. And if you go out to these other areas, you don't find any of them. And so what you find are a few very large governments, local governments, that are county governments, or else very large municipal governments. And so, for example, if you look at the Las Vegas area, the whole of metropolitan Las Vegas only has 13 governments and local governments in the public sector. It has hundreds of community associations. So the community associations took the place of the municipalities in New Jersey and New York and places like that, your Scarsdales or whatever. On the other hand, if you look at a place like Pittsburgh, which is a traditional old Northeast city, you're looking at over 400 local governments in the public sector. And so that's why I labeled my book The Transformation of Local Government. That's the transformation right there. Or another example, the state of Minnesota has almost 1,800 local public governments. The state of Arizona, which is following this new model, has only 80, roughly. Okay, why did this happen? People wanted, especially for condos, rising land costs, pressure to build at higher densities. And so if you were going to build at higher densities, developers, you were going to have some form of collective living. Developers met the demand, but preferred not to have to stay and manage the property. Partly, it was going to be messy. Plus the owners themselves. I mean, this is intended to last for 50 or 100 or even 200 years. You never know. The developer might be bankrupt in 5 years. And so you don't want to be dependent on this developer to take care of your building. And so that was another thing. People, apparently, hard for a libertarian group to believe, maybe, they actually seem to want very tight controls over the actions of their neighbors. At least it appears that way, unless there's some major aberration taking place in the way the whole system is working. And so they could get it in private community associations, but not in municipal governments. So in terms of the interaction of neighbors, municipal governments are a lot freer than private community associations are. You can get better services, you can contract with private parties more easily. You don't have a union that was recognized by the municipality in 1935 or something like that. You have swimming pools, golf courses, tennis courts, nature trails, bird watching, clubs, speeches, all these things are done by community associations to try to make the place more attractive, raise the selling price of the units, that works according to theory. Also, because it's private, you can segregate a little bit anyway. Not too much, but the most important form of segregation are senior citizen communities, which are all over the United States. You would probably have a hard time creating a senior citizen community in a municipality. Now the other reason is one that doesn't fit the model very well, which is actually some local public governments have actually decided they like these associations a lot. And the reason is because they can pass off a lot of the costs of government. And since they're all stretched, and in California they have little property tax limitations and so forth, what they've discovered is that if you have a community association, they, take care of the streets, they take care of the garbage, they have security patrols of their own and a lot of things. So it can save the municipality a lot of money. And so in some cases now, they're even, and this is violating the libertarian tenets, they're even requiring these associations as a matter of law in order to, to get a development approved. Okay, wide range of sizes. I've already talked about that. I've talked about that. These are some of the things associations do. Now, it has not eliminated the local public government role. As I say, it's shifted it to counties, which can be, 1 million people in one county. And so these counties are, they're forms of local government, but there's only 3,000 counties in the United States, and maybe 40,000 municipal governments and 300,000 community associations. So they're big. And what do? They continue now, in most places, to provide education. Education is on the cutting edge. It could shift to the community association, at least elementary education. Could have a community association charter school, for example, in the future. I kind of anticipate that way very well happen. But for water and sewer, highways, basic police services, investigating a murder or something, the association is not going to do that. Or fire protection or criminal justice system. Those things are still done locally for the most part, but through these much larger forms of local government. Again, we talked about private associations. Obviously, they have to have a way to pay. They pay through what are called assessments, but you could call them private taxes, and they're usually often based on the unit. So they actually amount to almost like a head tax, interestingly, which is in some ways probably, like the land tax, the most efficient form of taxation. And the assessments are set by the board of directors, and they vary all over the place. The degree of services provided by associations varies hugely, so it can go from $50 per month to, $2,000 per month and up. And so another thing is, so we have basically, you could think of it as we've privatized the civil service. And instead of government employees, you have property management firms. The developer initially hires this firm when the thing is getting going. After the owners take over, they can hire a new property management firm. They can fire the existing managers. It's a lot easier to fire your management firm than to get rid of your civil service. And anyway, there are about 10,000 of these the last time I looked, these firms in the United States. So they've become a minor industry in themselves. Okay, are these associations free? No, not exactly, but neither is a business corporation. They're similar to business corporations operate within a very extensive network of regulatory and state controls. And Delaware, they like the ones in Delaware, they don't like them in some other places and so forth. But anyway, so associations are subject to the same kind of state oversight as, let's say, a business corporation would be. A lot of it relates to rules for open disclosure of information, how voting is conducted. Again, what the unit owners in the association are like the stockholders of the business. So you have a lot of collective action problems, both in, private doesn't mean you eliminate collective action problems. They exist in severe forms in both business and in community associations at times. A lot of associations work well, but a lot of them don't. And so the federal government has been so far very minimally involved. It's one of the few areas that the federal government hasn't stuck its nose into. It may try eventually, but so far we're relatively free. I'm out of time. I've kind of already talked about these things. This is kind of the larger context. You could say that modern life brings greater interdependencies. So even in the private sector, we've had to have major institutional evolution to deal with the closeness of living or doing business, and the scale of it also. And there are economies of scale. So we had in the late 19th century an enormous shift in business from the individual entrepreneur to the business corporation. So by analogy, I say we've had a similar shift with respect to residential property ownership in the late 20th century, 100 years later. And it's gone from individually owned homes, individually owned properties, to collective ownership on a massive scale, as I've already documented. And all those trends I showed you are continuing or accelerating. So we could see half the country in these associations, let's say, in 30 or 40 years. So that's about it. I think I've said all of those things. So that's kind of where we are in associations in the United States.